So, our main topic this week is press releases. Um, to, I suppose, start things off right, I need to admit that the way I'm going to talk about these is something that's going to come up again and again and again in this class, which is to say, there are certain conventions for press releases, but by and large, the content and the form you use, the stylistic choices you make, these are all going to be on a case-by-case basis. There are a lot of things that are simply up to you, and you're going to have to decide what makes most sense in the situation that you're in. So, that being said, let's talk a bit about the role of the press release. So, press releases are essentially meant to connect your organization to the public, but doing so through a media source. You release press releases primarily so that people like journalists are able to look at them, see what kind of news you are making available to the public, and then writing a fast story or putting together a quick story to show on the news or something like that. It essentially, I suppose one way we can say this is that it creates an opportunity for news outlets to create stories quickly by giving them as much information as you can with as many important details as you possibly can, so that somebody could quickly turn what's available in the press release into an inverted pyramid style news story in a matter of minutes. So, you are essentially hoping to get news coverage. That's the big hope here. Your organization is doing something like launching a new product, or sponsoring an event, or something along those lines, and you want people to know about it. And so, you can put out ads on your own, but that costs money, you have to pay for the placement. But if you can release a press release, get it out to journalists, well, those journalists then have an easy story that they can write, and if it appears in a newspaper, if it appears online, or in the nightly news, anything like that, suddenly your message is out there, the public is seeing it, or hearing it, or reading it, and you only had to put out the effort to put together the press release. So, essentially, they serve a very important function, and ideally they kind of save you some money because you don't have to do as much advertising, and you get the added bonus of appearing in a journalistic context. So you really want to use these to your advantage. They give you legitimacy. If your story about your new product appears in the news, well, that's going to carry a whole lot more weight with people than if you just bought up some airtime and talked about it yourself. So, ideally, the press release is going to help you not only spread your message, but give your message more credibility than it would have if you just disseminated it all on your own. So, what are we really talking about doing with a press release? I'm going to break this down into a few sections, things that you generally have to have, things that you can consider putting in, and then strategic considerations. I would absolutely, for these upcoming parts, I would recommend pausing this video and possibly pulling out the handout, pulling up the handout file that I've made available, and possibly looking at a couple of the examples that are made available in the this week's module. So you might want to look at those, or look at the handout and go along. The wording is the same as it is on the handout, but hopefully I'll provide enough extra information. It will make that all make more sense. So let's begin. You must include, you need to start off with some kind of text that tells us, that tells a journalist what to do with the information. So if it's something you want to go out immediately, you will put for immediate release. In general, this is all in capital letters. It needs to be easy to spot. So it goes up at the top of the page before the headline. If you have news that for some reason needs to be held off a bit, but you want to give journalists a chance to write up their story early, or the news to put together like some kind of video package for it, that's fine. This can happen in cases where like maybe your company is going to do a product announcement on a particular day, but you want to wait for the news to announce that product after you've done your official product announcement. Or if, say, you're going to have some kind of event and you want to have news about that event only show up like the day before the event occurs. If you have a reason to put off the timing, there's no reason not to go ahead and write the press release. Just make sure you have embargoed until, and then the date on which you are fine with the news being released to the public. So then after you have that, you should have a headline. So whatever is going to catch the eye. You don't have to be particularly snappy or clever here. Just put what's important to know about what's happening. If you have had a breakthrough in your R&D department, then scientific breakthrough. List what's going on. If you are having an event, say what the event is and what date it's going to be, or what benefit it has for the public. If you're going to announce a new product or changes to an existing product, then put that in your headline. Whatever the big point you need to get across, put that in the headline. And usually this is in bold or a larger typeface and centered. Just make it clear that it's important. Then you want to have the author and the date. So that would, if you're the person writing the press release, that's you, and the date that you are writing this. So if you are embargoing until a later date, this is where you put what today's date is. If you are immediately releasing it, then you just have whatever date you are writing it and expecting it to go out. And then, in general, this is something that changes, especially with stylistic considerations, but provided it's something that's easy to nail down, you'll put a location. Sometimes location doesn't appear if it's something like a company policy change, where it doesn't really matter where it happens, or it happens in multiple locations. But if it's something specific, like an event, then you want to list the location of where that event is occurring. And oftentimes that's in bold, sometimes in italics, and oftentimes in the first line of the first paragraph. If you look through the examples, you'll see a couple different ways of doing this. So just essentially what this list so far is showing us is that you need to be able to express when the news is supposed to go out, what the news is about, and then the who, what, and where of it. So then a few more things that you should probably include in the press release. Well, I'm sorry, not should probably. You should definitely include body copy. And in general, you can break this up into 3 paragraphs. You can have longer press releases, you can have shorter press releases, but as just a general outline or guideline here, you can think about it as 3 paragraphs or 3 major sections. So just like if you are writing a news story and using the inverted pyramid style, with a press release you want to start with your first paragraph having the absolute most important details. If nothing else is communicated about your event or your product or your organization, then this is what goes in the first paragraph, just the most important things. So put those all up front, make it clear, write it plainly, simply, easy to follow, put it first. Then in the second paragraph, that's where you start putting in things like quotes or a description that's going to be a little bit more richer, more closer to prose. You put these in here because it's easier for a journalist to then pull those things out and insert them in the story where they're needed. And then your third paragraph is what's referred to as boilerplate, which, as a term, that generally refers to a preset writing that is used in every press release or is used frequently in communications about the organization or the company. So this can include things like statements that have been issued by important people in the company. It can be mission statements. It can be general like PR policy or whatever it makes sense to add in towards the end. Saying that, I should also state that you should only put in the boilerplate that makes sense for the the press release that you are putting out there. So if I'm putting out a press release that's about an upcoming event we're holding, and my third section, I include something about my company's mission statement, most people aren't going to care about my company's mission statement if all they care about is wanting to go to this event. So really, I would say this is just where if you have something that was pre-written by your company that would be important or useful for people to know, this is where you include it. If you don't have anything like that, if you are just telling us that, say, a new product is coming out, well then maybe what you might want to use is something like a pre-written About Us section that's available on the website, or something like that, that isn't necessarily, brand new information. It's things that have been said before, but it's still useful, or possibly something that might appear in a journalistic story about whatever's happening. So essentially your third paragraph is your chance to go find other things that people have written before you and put them in. Though I would say, in general, you want to be careful about this, especially if you are not working in a PR department within a company, but rather a PR department that's been hired by a company. You'll have to check and make sure that they're happy with you reusing copy that they've written, so you don't have any kind of weird copyright problems or anything like that. So be careful with attribution there, but for the most part, that's where you can put in things other people have written. Then at some point, either before the body of the press release or afterwards, you want to put in some contact information so that if the journalist wants to get more information about what's going on, they can contact you or contact a spokesperson who can then provide them any additional quotes or media items or background information that they might want. And finally, to signal the very end of the press release, you put in 3 pound symbols. So if you look through our examples, you'll see a couple examples of that. There are a few alternatives that are used in certain industries and in certain other countries, I believe, but for the most part, the triple pound symbol is a pretty easily recognizable general way to end a press release. So you put that there, and that signals that the press release is over. Ever so often there's a little bit of information that follows that, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So next up, I'll talk about things that you generally should consider including, but only include it if it's going to be useful for communicating what you need to communicate. So, our optional list. Contact information of a journalist or editor. So this is if you specifically know that you're sending your press release to a particular journalist or editor. So as you create press releases, as you work in the PR world, it's possible that you will cultivate a relationship with a particular journalist or a particular editor at a publication or news outlet. And so they've frequently done stories about your company or your organization in the past. If that's the case, by all means, send your press release directly to those people. Give them the first shot at getting the scoop on your organization, and then you'll want to put their contact information up there to, I suppose, document that the information is meant specifically for them. But then also, furthermore, it makes it more like a business letter where everybody is clearly labeled, and I suppose it adds an extra personal touch. Your third paragraph. So the section that I refer to as boilerplate, you can change it to be something like a dedicated about section. So if there's particular people you talk about in your press release, if there are other organizations maybe that are coming into play, then you might want to consider just writing about and then talking about who or what those people, organizations, or entities are. So that's another way, I suppose, to conceptualize that third paragraph area. And then also a potential choice is to, I suppose this becomes more and more common, and I think it's a good practice in general. If your company keeps your press releases online, which, depending on the size of the company, this is becoming more and more common, you might want to include a link to that press release from the press release you send out. That way, whoever is getting these, the journalists or editors that are receiving the press releases, they will have a way to go back and kind of like index that press release for the future. Because even if their copy gets deleted or lost, if they have a link, they can then always go back and find it again. All right, so then we have certain strategic considerations. So when you're putting together your press release, there are specific things you want to think about and consider doing. So you want to, if possible, send your press releases to journalists that cover your specific topic. So if you are working in City Hall and you are putting together a press release because of a new town beautification campaign, then you want to send your press release to somebody who frequently covers things that happen in local government. If there is a journalist out there who does that, that person is then going to be most likely to turn your press release into a story. If you are writing about some kind of like new outdoors product, your company is marketing something new, then by all means send your press release to the journalists who cover things like outdoor consumer goods, or send it to the magazines that are specifically about outdoor recreation. All of these things can further your goals by increasing the chance that your press release will be turned into a news story. You should generally send press releases out in the morning by email. You want them to, whoever receives the press release, you want them to have time to put it together into a news story and be able to meet their deadlines. So the morning is usually the best time for that. And then in general, especially if you have a relationship with the journalist or editor you are sending a press release to, it's a good idea to follow up with a phone call, possibly later in the day, just to find out, if they've seen your press release, do they need any further information, are there any files you can send over to them? All of these things can be useful, and if you can instigate that, if you can cultivate a relationship, then that is absolutely wonderful. But that being said, don't inundate anybody with phone calls. The last thing you want is to be labeled annoying, so you want to be careful with that. A few more things to take into consideration. Sometimes, and especially if you are sending out electronic copies of your press release, you want to possibly include keywords towards the top of your document, especially when your documents are hosted on a website. This can really increase the visibility of the document simply because of the way that search engines will comb through and index pages. A lot of that will be determined by the text that's at the top of the page. So including keywords can help you create press releases that are more easily found. And if you are emailing press releases, one very important thing to think about is copy pasting your press release into the body of the email. The problem is if you attach your file very often, either, first off, it's another step to make people do to download the attachment and then open it up, which to us that may not sound like doing a lot, but if you have 100 emails and you're just going through one by one, it's going to be just another thing you have to do. So if you can get rid of that little extra bit of frustration and just put your text into the body of the email, that's great. some organizations, especially newspaper or journalistic organizations, will sometimes automatically get rid of attachments as they come in through like an email filter, and you never want all of your content to be lost, because chances are nobody's going to email you back and say, oh, by the way, I was combing through my 100 emails for this morning and I noticed that you said your file was attached, but I'm not receiving it. So just go ahead, make sure you don't run into any of those problems, and copy paste your text into the body of the email. And finally, and I mean this is really the bottom line of things, you want to make sure that your press release answers who, what, where, when, why, and how. So everything that the journalist is going to want to put in their story, you need to be able to answer for those. So go through it, write your press release, and then when you're done, read it through to yourself and ask, can I answer all of these questions? Is there anything else that someone who is writing a story about this would want to know? And if there is, figure out a place to put that in. Alright, so next up, you should see the press release assignment with descriptions on how to put that together. Just as a, I suppose, short introduction to that, what I'll say is what I want you to do for this class is to write a press release. It can be short, it can be long, it is up to you. Really, I'm not going to give you a word count or a page count or anything like that, because going forward as strategic communication professionals, what you're going to have to start doing is deciding for yourself what constitutes good work. So when you write it, you should feel like you have said everything that needs to be said. And so if for you that's a total of 6 sentences, then fantastic. If you need to communicate this in 2 pages, that's also fantastic. Whatever it takes you to feel happy with your work, that's what you need to do. And so you want to be able to set those standards on your own. So go forth, write some press releases. Absolutely, you can make things up. I don't need to have real details. These don't have to be real events or real products or even real companies. I just want to see that you can use the form and then write in a way that best communicates the message you're trying to get across. So go look at that assignment, and I suppose I will talk to you again next week.